Hello, everybody. My name is Andrew McKenzie. Today I'm going to talk to you about some avian conservation efforts on a local natural gas pipeline. I can't necessarily give the name of the pipeline because of the contract I signed, but it goes through West Virginia, and it's been about a 7 year process that just recently finished up. So hopefully that can kind of narrow it down for you guys to figure out where I'm talking about. Uh, Next slide. So Cheyenne did introduce me, but as I said, my name is Andrew McKenzie. I received a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife and Fisheries from West Virginia University with minors in conservation ecology and then agriculture and natural resources law. I just finished up my master's degree at WVU, getting my master's of agriculture and natural resources. I've worked several different tech jobs throughout college, from alligators to turtles to wetlands and pretty much any different type of animal you can think of. Over the summer, I was a lead avian surveyor for environmental solutions and innovations. And then on the 1st of October, I started my new job as an environmental specialist with Williams Forestry and Associates. Williams Forestry and Associates is the leading tree planting organization east of the Mississippi. So between October and May, I'll be conducting reforestation on mitigated sites and solar panel sites. Just to give you guys a brief outline about what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to start with some avian conservation history. Going to link this to the avian conservation efforts that we had in action on the local pipeline that I worked at. And then after I talk about the conservation efforts, I'm going to talk about some potential adaptive management or how we can do things better. The picture on your right is a bird located on the edge of the right of way. I can't figure out what bird it is, which is why I didn't identify it, but I apologize. So I'm going to start by talking about stuff that you hopefully have heard about, but just want to reinforce it. During the 1800s, birds were in a significant decline because of plume hats or plumage hats and then market hunting. So on the top, I have a few pictures of some of the hats that were being worn, leading to um, a decline in birds. And then on the bottom, I have a picture of what was called a punt gun. And these guns were used to shoot hundreds of birds at a time. I have a few quotes here that kind of talk about how not overpopulated, but how many birds were in the area during the 1800s. Thomas Morton said he had more than 1,000 geese before the muzzle of his gun at one time when he was partaking in market hunting. And then to talk about the plumage hats and their issues, there's a quote from Douglas Brinkley in his book, The Wilderness Warrior, Theodore Roosevelt and the Crusade for America, which is more than 5 million birds were being massacred yearly to satisfy the booming North American millinery trade. These two issues combined sparked a pretty large movement to conserve birds. And the first step was in 1896, Harriet Hemingway on the bottom, and then Mina B. Hall on the top led a movement that would change conservation. They organized several teas to convince Boston society women to abstain from wearing their plume hats. And these meetings eventually led to the founding of the Massachusetts Audubon Society. Through these efforts, the Audubon Model Law passed in 1901, which protected water birds from plume hunting. In 1903, President Teddy Roosevelt created the first national wildlife refuge on Florida's Pelican Island, which is pictured on the bottom left. The National Association of Audubon Societies started to become incorporated in New York State in 1905. In 1910, New York State legislature enacted the Audubon Plumage Law, which prohibited the sale or possession of feathers from protected bird species. And then between 1913 and 1918, what we now call the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was passed and ratified. Then throughout the mid 1900s, a big issue was DDT, and the Audubon first brought this issue about in 1945. In 1960, the Audubon Society began documenting the decline of bird species such as bald eagles. In 1962, Silent Spring from Rachel Carson was published documenting additional harm from DDT. In 1972, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, banned the use of DDT. And then in 1973, the Endangered Species Act was passed, which helps protect threatened and endangered species. On the bottom left, there's a picture of a kid being sprayed with DDT, which I always find interesting every time I see it. And then on the top left is a clip from a newspaper advertisement, basically boasting the benefits of getting rid of the insects to help increase food supply. So you may be wondering, why does all this matter? There's been several laws since, but those laws were the kind of the foundation to set the practices that we have in place now, protecting birds through various impacts. And that brings me to the impact of the natural gas industry. These pictures are not from the site that I was working at, but when people think of natural gas pipelines, these are the pictures that they see. We've all probably heard horror stories of a natural gas line bursting or wetlands and streams being impaired from these pipelines. And a lot of the times you see these pictures of barren soil with the pipe going into the ground. Oops, that slide's supposed to be later. But what you guys don't see is typically what these pipeline sites look like after the pipe is in the ground, and the potential that they have to provide habitat for birds and other animals. So this is a picture from the pipeline that I was working on. And then here's another picture of the pipeline I was working on. You can see it's not all doom and gloom. I'm not here to advocate or be against natural gas pipelines, but I do want to show the potential for what the sites could look like afterwards. Go back for a second. So this is all possible with the laws that are in place, creating resources for management. IPAC, which is on the left-hand side, is a project planning tool that's is used to satisfy environmental review processes and protocols. We use this on the pipeline project. We worked to find which species the government was concerned about being impacted. And then rivets is more for mitigation, but if you're to impair a stream, it kind of keeps track of stream impairment and wetland impairment. And it's another resource that I've commonly used. And just skip past these real quick. So I know that you guys may not be able to see this list, but we had, I think, somewhere around 30 birds that we had to be concerned about with the pipeline that was being constructed. Some of the birds that you would think of are cerulean warbler, blue-winged warbler, yellow-winged or golden-winged warbler, sorry, northern saw-whet owl. There were other birds such as the wood thrush that was on here. A couple of notable birds that were not on this list. The rose-breasted grosbeak wasn't on this list because the federal government wasn't worried about their habitat being declined. And then there were no birds of prey outside of the bald eagle and the golden eagle that were of concern. On the right-hand side, I have a barred owl that was using the edge of the pipeline right away, hunting for food during a survey. And then I have a killdeer nest that we located on one of the access roads. So to kind of put all of the effort that we were doing into a day-to-day survey, I created a little slide, and we would start by getting a section of pipeline that needed to be surveyed. These sections of pipeline were surveyed once every 7 days. When we did these surveys, we had 5-minute point counts that were conducted every 250 meters, or roughly every 800 feet. They'd be auditory and visual point counts. I would sit there with a clipboard and write down what I heard, and then I would have a technician with binoculars that was scanning for birds, bird nests, bird nesting behavior. We'd conduct these point counts 30 minutes before sunrise up until 3 hours after sunrise. When we were conducting these bird counts, the things that we were mostly concerned about or keeping an eye out for was bird nests and bird nesting behavior. We would conduct nest searches as we were walking along the right of way. So when we weren't doing our point counts and we were walking to the next point, we were looking on the ground to see if we could find any bird nests. We were looking in the trees to see if there was any visible nests. And then we were keeping an eye out for any bird nesting behavior, such as birds carrying food or birds singing to one another, pairs of birds. Um, if we were to find a species of concern or a bird that we believe to be exhibiting nesting behavior, we would conduct a 30-minute occupancy survey at minimum, up to a 60-minute occupancy survey. I have a picture of a male cerulean warbler and some really good nesting habitat along the right-of-way of the pipeline. When we were doing these occupancy surveys, we'd keep an eye out on the bird that we located. And then for this, for the cerulean warbler specifically, we were checking the trees for any signs of birds kind of going in and out under some large clusters of leaves where they typically nest. And if we did find a nest, we would mark the nest. On the right-hand side, you can see the sensitive resource area sign. We would buffer these either 15 meters if it was in a grassland or 30 meters if it was in a forested area. When we marked these nests, nobody was allowed to go inside the buffer area except for us. We tried to avoid going inside the buffer area at all costs unless we needed to physically check the nest to see if there were still eggs, if they had become hatchlings, or if they successfully fledged. And then a little bit more about our nest protocol. Once we located the nest, we'd identify it, we'd record the species, the nest location, the nest activity, we'd create the buffer, and then we would let the lead environmental inspector know that there was a bird nest on the pipeline. If there was a bird nest on the pipeline, they weren't allowed to work inside the buffer area, and they did their best. The company that we were working with did their best to kind of avoid the area at all costs. Once a week, we would conduct a nest check. We would check the nest every week to see where the status of the nest was. We would monitor how many eggs were there, if they had hatched, if they did hatch, if the birds were present, if there were baby birds present, were they hatchlings, nestlings, fledglings. And then once the nest was marked as inactive, meaning the birds either fledged or there was a mortality event, we would go back each day for 3 days to ensure the nest was abandoned and not being used. After that 3 day mark of being an inactive nest, we would remove the nest and we would remove the buffer. Removing this nest was to discourage any other birds from laying eggs on the pipeline and hopefully nesting elsewhere. And then we'd completely remove and destroy the nest. The pictures I have here are from the pipeline I was working on. On the left-hand side, there was a prairie warbler nest and a multiflora rosebush. Second to the left is a northern cardinal fledgling, or I mean hatchling. Second to the right was an eastern phoebe nest with a mortality from a snake. You can't see it too well, but there was a snake shed and some snake poop in that little area. And then on the far right is a successfully fledged field sparrow nest. And although we were there strictly for birds, we did find several turtles and several snakes. The snakes were only passing through, so there wasn't too many conservation efforts for them. However, I would say we ran into about 25 eastern box turtles. Um, the state of West Virginia does not have any protection for eastern box turtles. However, we worked with the environmental inspector and they allowed us to put a buffer around any known box turtle nests. So there's a picture on the right-hand side of one of the eastern box turtles we found with a recently finished nest. If you take a look, it's pretty hard to find these nests unless there's a turtle actively laying eggs. Once they lay their eggs, they would take the straw bedding and kind of push it over their nest so that nobody or nothing could find them. But I thought it was a pretty nice surprise that they were willing to work with the species that did not legally have to be protected. And so to kind of go into some of the successes of the project, there was really good communication between the organizations that were working there. So us, the bird people, and then the pipeline construction crew, they were all well, I wouldn't say all, most of them were very interested in what we were doing and why we were doing it. They would always ask what kind of birds were nesting, how they could prevent any mortality, and they seemed extremely interested in the conservation efforts themselves. Mutual interests. I don't think anybody wants to kill animals intentionally. On the pipeline, it was pretty apparent that they were all trying to, they were trying to do their job of building the pipeline, but at the same time, they wanted to do their best to be mindful of the animals that were there. Um, Protecting the nests, we had a pretty high success rate of nests. The only mortalities that we had from nests were not caused by the construction of the pipeline. So the nests mortality that we encountered were either from snakes or from, sorry, either from snakes or crows. And then education and outreach, I alluded to it a little bit beforehand, but the construction workers learned what we were doing, why we were doing it, and how it helped conserve the species that would have likely perished if we weren't out there. And then on the left-hand side, I have a picture of a box turtle. Directly below it, I have a picture of one of the box turtle buffers that we put up. On the top right is an eastern phoebe nest under one of their bridges. And then on the bottom right is a nest that we found on the pipeline, and all three of the birds successfully fledged. Of course, there were some conservation concerns. On the top left, there's a box turtle that had been run over. I do want to make the disclaimer that it wasn't run over by the construction crew. It was run over by a landlord that was using, or a landowner that was using the right of way, and just ran over the box turtle with an ATV. On the top right-hand side, you can see that it takes a while for the vegetation to establish. So this is directly after they had put the pipeline in and graded it. There's a whole bunch of seed, a whole bunch of riprap, and that goes directly into a stream. You can see that stream's pretty muddy. On the bottom left, there's a work truck that was running idle on diesel. There was a bird nest directly behind it, and we had just finished putting the buffer up and we're waiting to see what kind of species was using the nest. And they were just idling their truck the whole time. And then on the bottom right, you can just see the equipment that was being used, the sheer number of heavy machines. There are practices to prevent them from leaking any oil or causing any environmental harm. I didn't see any issues with that, but I heard a lot of stories that they weren't always following the rules. And it was difficult to kind of have a say in what they should do because we were subcontracted through them. So the pipeline construction company was technically our boss. We did do everything that we were supposed to do. However, we couldn't enforce any rules or regulations. We had to kind of a few times toe the line of if the buffer should be 15 feet, but there's a travel road. They didn't want to stop work entirely, so we may have to move the buffer instead of being 15 feet wide to 5 feet wide so they could pass over the bridge with their equipment. Incidental take, you know, although we're out there to protect the animals, a few of them would still perish. I ran into several construction workers that were on the opposite end of being interested. I think my second or third day back in my second year, I was just told that everybody needs a job when I told them why we were out there. And then a big thing is obviously habitat change. You're fragmenting large forests. There's a big loss of forest. There's plenty of wetlands and streams that are being impacted. Um, Fragmentation and loss of forest may not all be bad, but it's a pretty important note to make. And then I wanted to say thanks and open it up to questions because I figured there would be a decent amount of questions that I would do my best to answer and give you the information that I can.
Thank you, Andrew. Is there any questions? I have a question. Did you have any particularly interesting encounters bird-wise? I remember you said you got a pretty good picture of a cerulean warbler. Um,
Yeah, I was very surprised at the number of rose-breasted grosbeak, cerulean warblers, golden wing warblers, blue wing warblers we ran into. Um, I had a few blackpoll warblers. There were black and white warblers everywhere. When I started working on this project 2 years ago, I fully expected it to kind of be an ecological wasteland, but when you got out there, it was, I mean, besides the massive project going on, it was kind of hard to tell that there was a huge disturbance based on just the what we consider rare species in West Virginia.
hmm. Looks like we have a few questions in the chat. Lee J asks, were you observing cowbirds on the edges?
Yeah, Lee J. So asked if I was observing cowbirds. We did not have too many cowbirds between May and July. Once we got towards August, we had a few cowbirds. Um, I'd say maybe one every 2 or 3 days, which wasn't nearly the amount that I was expecting. And then I see Hannah's question. Hannah asked, were there a lot of invasive plants in the pipeline corridors? Um, there were not a lot of invasive plants on the pipeline corridors. They have mitigation requirements that they have to hydro seed after they, go through the soil disturbance. This year was a little difficult to tell because it was mostly clover and rye that was popping up. They did plant native herbaceous mixes, but with the drought, everything was suffering. So it was kind of hard to see what native plants were growing and what native plants weren't growing. However, last year when I was down in Fayette County, West Virginia, near Summersville, it kind of looked like a native prairie almost with the number of native herbaceous plants that were on the pipeline. And if they have a high number of invasives, they have to remove them because of the EPA and mitigation requirements that they're held to. And then there's another question from Lee J. What month were the blackpolls present? The two blackpoll warblers that I encountered were in Harrison County, and in Harrison County, I saw them both in late July. Then another question from Hannah, were you seeing lots of pollinating insects? I saw a ton of pollinators. There was a lot of true flies or dipteras. Um, a lot of people don't know that they're really good pollinators, but they are. And then we saw a whole bunch of bees. We actually had another division of the company doing pollinator plots to see what kind of bees were out there. We didn't have any rusty patch bumblebees, but I think at the highest end for diversity, we had, I think, 17 native bee species, and then like I think it was a total of like 84 insects in total that were all considered pollinators.
Can I ask a
Any
question?
Yes, of course.
I'm just curious. Is there any interest or use of drones to help expand the area that you can observe and make it a little more broad in what you're doing?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. When I came on 2 years ago, I asked the same question actually, and I mentioned acoustic recording units, which are similar to trail cameras where you put them out there and then they record sound instead of pictures. Because the protocol was already written, we couldn't change what we were doing. However, the company is going to start taking ARUs to put them out on similar projects to see what birds are calling throughout that whole 3.5 hour time period. And then with respect to drones, their concern is that they're not going to be able to see the birds. And if they do see the birds, they're not sure if they're going to be able to identify them. Um, they've talked about it, but I'm not sure if they're going to enact anything with the drone technology that we have.
Thank you.
Right. Anyone? Alrighty. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for your work and all the info you gave us, and just like the perspective on it, especially the firsthand knowledge. So,
Yeah, thank
um,
you guys for having me. And if anybody wants to reach out, my email's at the bottom. Feel free to contact me and I'll get back to you guys as soon as I can.
awesome. Well, I think that is all we have for this evening's program. Again, check your newsletters for more, or the Facebook for more updated information on the next program and for our fall trips. And remember, the bird seed order is due October 18th. So I hope you guys have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kitty.